Why would a man pay $5 and risk his life for a woman who screamed she'd never belonged to anyone? The iron cage creaked as wind slammed through the saloon's broken shutters. Inside, a woman pressed her face against the bars, her green eyes blazing with fury that 3 weeks of captivity hadn't dimmed. The drunk rancher counting crumpled bills laughed at her defiance. But the quiet stranger in the corner had been watching for an hour, his hand resting on something hidden in his coat pocket. By the end of this story, you'll discover how a simple gold ring and $5 changed the fate of an entire frontier town, and why the woman's final words would be remembered for decades. But first, the facts that led to this moment. The woman wasn't supposed to be there. The rancher wasn't supposed to own her. And the stranger? He'd been hunting them both for reasons no one in Perdition could have imagined. It started when Catherine Morrison disappeared from her father's ranch outside Santa Fe. Vanished without a trace while hanging laundry on a Tuesday morning. What the family didn't know was that she'd been sold, traded by her own stepmother to settle gambling debts that threatened to destroy them all. The transaction had been clean. Legal papers, witnessed signatures. A bill of sale that would hold up in any territorial court, assuming anyone cared enough about one woman's freedom to challenge it. But this wasn't about law. This was about something deeper, darker, and infinitely more profitable than simple slavery. Catherine Morrison was beautiful, educated, and came from money. In the right hands, she could be worth a fortune to the kind of men who collected rare things. The problem was getting her to the right buyer without attracting attention from federal marshals who'd been cracking down on human trafficking along the Santa Fe Trail. That's where Jake Brennan came in. Brennan owned the Perdition saloon and half the buildings around it. More importantly, he owned Sheriff Dale Hutchins, 3 judges, and enough corrupt officials to make inconvenient people disappear permanently. When the traffickers brought Catherine to his establishment, Brennan saw opportunity. "She's worth more than gold," he told his partner that first night, watching Catherine pace her cage like a trapped wildcat. "Right buyer'll pay $5,000, maybe $10," but keeping her was expensive. She refused to eat, tried to escape twice, and her constant screaming was driving away customers. Brennan had invested too much to let her starve. But every day she remained unsold was money bleeding from his pockets. That's when he made his first mistake. He got drunk and started bragging. "Got me a real prize upstairs," he slurred to anyone who'd listen. "Senator's daughter from back east. Worth more than this whole damn town." The story grew with each telling. A judge's wife, a railroad heiress, a Mexican governor's niece. By the time word reached the territorial capital, Catherine Morrison had become 3 different women, all of them important enough to matter to people who could make problems for men like Jake Brennan. One of those people was Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett. Garrett had been tracking human traffickers for 6 months, following a trail that led from Denver to El Paso and back again. He'd lost the scent in Albuquerque, but Brennan's loose tongue had given him a new lead. If there really was a high-value prisoner being held in Perdition, Garrett needed to investigate. The problem was jurisdiction. Perdition existed in a legal gray area between territories, and Sheriff Hutchins had made it clear that federal marshals weren't welcome. Garrett couldn't ride in with a badge and demand answers. He needed a different approach. He needed to go undercover. The stranger who walked into the Perdition saloon on that wind-swept Thursday evening looked like any other drifter seeking shelter and whiskey. Dusty clothes, worn boots, tired eyes. He ordered rotgut without complaint, paid in silver coins, and kept to himself in the corner booth where he could watch everything without being watched. What Jake Brennan didn't notice was how those tired eyes cataloged every face, every conversation, every detail that might prove useful later, or how the stranger's hand never strayed far from the Colt hidden beneath his coat. "You hear that screaming upstairs?" Brennan asked his bartender, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the sound of money, boys. Pure profit." The stranger looked up from his drink. "Sounds like trouble to me." "Only trouble's keeping her fed." Brennan laughed. "But hell, right buyer comes along, she'll earn me enough to retire." "What kind of buyer?" Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd already said too much to too many strangers. The kind with deep pockets and shallow morals. "Why? You interested?" The stranger shrugged. "Depends what you're selling." "Come on up, take a look. But touching costs extra." They climbed the narrow stairs to where Catherine's cage sat in what had once been a storage room. The smell of fear and unwashed bodies hung thick in the air. She looked up when they entered, and for the first time in weeks, something besides defiance flickered in her eyes. Hope. The stranger saw it too. Also saw the bruises on her wrists, the tear in her dress, the way she instinctively shrank back when Brennan approached the bars. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" Brennan grinned. "Course she's got some fight in her. You'd need to break that spirit first." "You'll never own me," Catherine whispered, but her voice carried steel despite everything. "None of you will ever own me." The stranger stepped closer to the cage. Close enough that Catherine could see his eyes weren't the dull brown of a common drifter, but sharp gray that missed nothing. "What's your real name?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter?" "It might." Catherine studied his face for a long moment. Something about him was different from the others. Cleaner, steadier, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty. "Catherine Morrison. My father owns the Triple M Ranch outside Santa Fe." Brennan's smile faltered. He'd been told she was a runaway, sold by her own family to settle debts. If she really was a rancher's daughter, if people were looking for her. "She's lying," he said quickly. "Told me 3 different names already." But the stranger was reaching into his coat pocket, and what he pulled out made Brennan's blood turn cold. Not a weapon, though that would come later, but a small leather folder containing a deputy marshal's badge and a photograph. The photograph showed Catherine Morrison standing beside a tall man in rancher's clothes outside a large adobe house. The inscription on the back read, "Catherine and Father, Christmas 1881. "Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett," the stranger said calmly. "And you, Mr. Brennan, are under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and violation of federal statutes regarding interstate commerce." Brennan went for his gun. He was fast for a drunk man. Garrett was faster sober. The shot echoed through the building like thunder. Brennan spun and crashed into the wall, clutching his shoulder where Garrett's bullet had shattered bone. His own shot went wild, splintering wood inches from Catherine's cage. "Keys," Garrett said, his smoking Colt now aimed at Brennan's head. "Go to hell. Keys, or the next bullet goes between your eyes." Brennan fumbled for his key ring with his good hand, whimpering as blood seeped through his fingers. But before he could unlock the cage, boots thundered on the stairs. Sheriff Hutchins and 2 deputies burst through the door, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," Hutchins shouted. "You're under arrest for assault." Garrett didn't lower his Colt. "Federal jurisdiction, Sheriff. This man is wanted for kidnapping." "Not in my town, he ain't. Jake's a respected businessman. You're nothing but a drifter with a fake badge." Catherine watched the standoff with growing despair. So close to freedom, only to have it snatched away by corrupt local law. But Garrett seemed strangely calm for a man facing 3 guns. "Respected businessman?" he asked. "Is that what you call keeping women in cages?" "I call it running a business that pays taxes and keeps the peace. Something you outsiders don't understand." Garrett smiled, not the warm expression of a man enjoying a joke, but the cold calculation of someone playing a game 3 moves ahead of his opponents. "Tell me, Sheriff, what's the penalty for harboring federal fugitives?" "What fugitives?" "Jake Brennan here is wanted in Colorado for murdering a federal judge. Samuel Morrison. Ring any bells?" Catherine gasped. Judge Morrison had been her uncle, her father's brother, who disappeared 6 months ago while investigating territorial corruption. The family had assumed he'd been killed by outlaws. But if Brennan was responsible... Hutchins looked confused. "Judge Morrison died in a stagecoach robbery." "No," Garrett said. "Judge Morrison died because he was investigating human trafficking operations in Colorado. Operations that led back to your friend Jake. We found the evidence in his Denver office. Financial records, names, dates, everything." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded telegram. "This is from the territorial governor. Authorization to arrest Jake Brennan and anyone harboring him. Federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority." Hutchins squinted at the telegram, trying to read in the dim light. His 2 deputies shifted nervously. They hadn't signed up to fight federal marshals over a human trafficker. "Could be forged," Hutchins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be," Garrett agreed. "But are you willing to bet your career on it? Your pension? Your freedom?" The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Catherine held her breath, watching 3 men with guns decide her fate through the cold calculus of self-interest. It was one of the deputies who broke first. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "maybe we should let the federal boys sort this out. Ain't worth the trouble." "Shut up, Collins." But doubt had entered the room like smoke, and everyone could smell it. Hutchins looked from his bleeding friend to the grim-faced marshal, to the woman in the cage who might be worth more trouble than a crooked sheriff could handle. "Prove it," he said finally. "Prove she's really this Morrison girl." Catherine spoke before Garrett could answer. "My Uncle Samuel had a scar on his left hand from a knife fight in Abilene. 3 inches long, shaped like a crescent moon. He used to let me trace it when I was little. Said it reminded him that even judges could make mistakes. The specificity of the detail hit like a physical blow. Only family would know something that personal, that intimate." Hutchins felt his last advantage slipping away. But Jake Brennan, bleeding and desperate, made one final play. "She's lying," he gasped. "I got papers, bill of sale signed and witnessed. I bought her legal from her own stepmother." He fumbled in his coat pocket with his good hand and pulled out a folded document. "Right here, legal as church on Sunday." Garrett took the paper and examined it carefully. The signature looked genuine. The witness marks appeared authentic. For a moment, Catherine's heart sank. If the sale was legal, if her stepmother really had sold her. Then Garrett smiled. "Interesting document, Jake. Just one problem." "What problem?" "It's dated March 15th, 1882. Today is February 23rd. You're selling documents from the future." The paper was indeed forged. but not by a professional. Someone had tried to age it with coffee stains and wrinkles, but they'd made the mistake of using a calendar that hadn't caught up to reality. Hutchins stared at the impossible date, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and finally resignation. His deputies had already lowered their weapons. "Keys, Jake," Garrett said again. This time, Brennan complied. The cage doors swung open with a rusty squeal that sounded like freedom itself. Catherine stumbled out on unsteady legs, 3 weeks of captivity having weakened muscles that had once ridden horses across miles of New Mexico rangeland. Garrett caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness for a man who'd just been in a gunfight. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely true. Perdition was full of men who'd invested money in Jake Brennan's operation, men who wouldn't appreciate losing their investment to federal interference. As if summoned by his thoughts, angry voices began rising from the saloon below. Boots stamped on wooden floors, chairs scraped, the sound of men organizing for violence. "Back door?" Garrett asked Hutchins. The sheriff, his authority evaporated, could only nod toward the rear of the building. "Through the kitchen. Leads to the alley." "My horse?" "Tied out front with the others." Garrett cursed silently. Retrieving his mount would mean fighting through a crowd of armed men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by eliminating the federal marshal who just destroyed their business model. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts. "There's another way." "What way?" She pointed toward the window that faced the street. "The livery stable roof. We can jump across." Garrett looked at the gap between buildings, maybe 8 feet of open air above a 20-foot drop to hard-packed earth. In her weakened condition, Catherine might not make it. But staying meant facing a lynch mob that wouldn't discriminate between federal marshals and their prisoners. "Can you do it?" Catherine's smile was the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "I used to jump my horse across arroyos twice that wide. A roof should be easier." The sound of boots on stairs made the decision for them. Garrett smashed the window with his gun butt, clearing away the worst of the glass shards. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of horses and hay and the promise of escape. "Ladies first." Catherine backed up 3 steps, then sprinted toward the window. She leapt with the grace of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, her torn dress billowing as she flew across the gap. She landed hard on the livery roof, rolling to absorb the impact. But she was up and moving before Garrett could worry about broken bones. His own jump was less graceful, but equally successful. He crashed into the stable's wooden shingles just as angry men burst into the room they'd abandoned. "There, on the roof!" Gunshots cracked through the night air. Bullets whined past their heads, splintering wood and raising sparks where they struck metal. Garrett and Catherine scrambled across the angled roof toward the rear of the building where shadows offered concealment. Behind them, men were already climbing through the broken window, determined to finish what federal law had interrupted. The stable's rear roof overlooked a narrow alley that connected to the main road out of town. If they could reach the ground without breaking legs, they might escape on foot. Not ideal, but better than dying on a rooftop in a town that didn't exist on any official map. "There's a hay wagon." Catherine pointed to the alley below. "If we land in the center..." More gunshots. Closer this time. One bullet clipped the roof edge inches from Garrett's head, showering them both with splinters. They jumped together, falling 20 feet into loose hay that cushioned their landing like a giant pillow. Garrett rolled clear and helped Catherine to her feet, both of them covered in straw and dust, but miraculously uninjured. "Now what?" she asked. Before Garrett could answer, a new voice spoke from the shadows. "Now you come with me." An elderly Mexican man stepped into the moonlight, leading 2 saddled horses. His weathered face showed no fear despite the gunfire echoing from the buildings above. "Who are you?" Garrett demanded, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Miguel Santos. I work for Senor Morrison. He sent me to find his daughter." Catherine gasped. "Miguel? But how did you—" "Your father never stopped looking, mija. When word came that a woman matching your description was being held in Perdition, he sent me with gold and instructions to bring you home by any means necessary." The old man handed them the reins. "These horses are fast and strong. They will carry you to safety." "What about payment?" Garrett asked. "Your employer?" Miguel smiled. "Senor Morrison said to give you this." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a simple gold ring set with a single emerald, obviously valuable, but more importantly, obviously meaningful. "My mother's ring," Catherine whispered. "Father said he'd never part with it unless his daughter's life depended on it," Miguel finished. He wanted the marshal to know that some things are worth more than money. Garrett stared at the ring, understanding its significance. Not payment for services rendered, but recognition of sacrifice made. An acknowledgement that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "Tell your employer," he said finally, "that his daughter is braver than he knows, and that it was an honor to serve justice in her name." Miguel nodded gravely. "Vaya con Dios, Marshal. Señorita Catherine, ride hard. These men will follow, but they cannot match your horses in open country." As if summoned by his words, angry voices erupted from the stable above. Men were discovering their escape route, organizing pursuit. Time was running out. Garrett swung into his saddle and waited for Catherine to mount her horse. A beautiful mare with a deep chest and strong legs of a runner, bred for distance. Despite 3 weeks of captivity, Catherine sat the saddle like she'd been born there. "Ready?" he asked. Instead of answering, she leaned over and took his hand. Not romantically, but with the firm grip of partnership forged in crisis. "Thank you," she said simply. Then they were riding, hooves striking sparks from stone as they galloped through Perdition's twisted streets toward the open desert beyond. Behind them, the town erupted in chaos as Jake Brennan's allies realized their prize was escaping with a federal marshal who could destroy them all. The chase lasted 3 hours and covered 30 miles of brutal terrain. Catherine's mare proved as magnificent as she looked, matching Garrett's stallion stride for stride across arroyos and up rocky slopes that would have broken lesser animals. Their pursuers, mounted on inferior horses and hampered by darkness, gradually fell behind until the sound of hoofbeats faded into memory. They stopped at dawn beside a creek that wound through stands of cottonwood and willow. The horses drank deeply while their riders shared water and dried beef from Garrett's saddlebags. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, sitting on a fallen log while her horse grazed nearby. "Now you go home to your father. Help me testify against Brennan and his operation. Try to put this behind you." "What about you?" Garrett looked toward the horizon where heat waves were already beginning to shimmer. "Got other cases, other people who need help." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, "The ring. You should keep it. It belongs to your family. It belongs to someone who understands that freedom can't be bought or sold. someone who risks everything to open cages. She pressed the ring into his palm. Besides, you earned it. Garrett closed his fingers around the small piece of jewelry. Not because he wanted payment, but because he understood what she was really giving him. Acknowledgement that his work mattered, that justice served in dark places still counted as justice. I'll treasure it, he said simply. They parted ways at the creek. Catherine rode south toward Santa Fe and a father who'd never stopped searching. Garrett rode east toward his next case, carrying news of Jake Brennan's arrest and evidence that would destroy a human trafficking network spanning 3 territories. 6 months later, newspapers across the Southwest would report that Jake Brennan had been sentenced to life in federal prison. Sheriff Dale Hutchins and his deputies were dismissed and charged with corruption. The Perdition saloon was burned to the ground by townspeople who'd finally found the courage to clean up their community. But the story that people remembered, the one they told around campfires and in general stores from Santa Fe to Denver, was simpler. A woman in a cage had screamed that no one would ever own her. A federal marshal had risked everything to prove her right. And a simple gold ring had become the symbol of something more valuable than money. The price of human dignity in a land where freedom was never guaranteed. Years later, when Thomas Garrett finally retired from federal service, he would carry that ring in his pocket as a reminder that the most important victories couldn't be measured in arrests made or convictions secured. They could only be measured in the moments when justice, however delayed, finally arrived for people who'd been forgotten by everyone else. And somewhere in New Mexico, Catherine Morrison, now Catherine Morrison Garrett, for love had indeed grown from that shared moment of crisis, would tell their children about the night freedom came with the thunder of hoofbeats and the courage to jump across impossible gaps. The ring, passed down through generations, carried with it a simple lesson: that some prices are worth paying, some cages are meant to be opened, and some promises, like "you'll never own me," are kept not with words, but with action. In the end, it hadn't cost $5 to free Catherine Morrison. It had cost everything Thomas Garrett was willing to risk, and everything Catherine was determined to reclaim. The money was just a symbol. The real currency had been courage and justice and the refusal to look away when others chose blindness. Don't forget to subscribe and consider giving a like to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.